This is a photograph of a man in his late 70s. Exactly what you're seeing depends on the settings of your screen, the environment around you. If there's sun shining on the screen, you'll be able to make out less, and obviously the state of your vision. If you can't see as well, you can't see as well. But the chances are that you have a good enough idea of this man's face that you could pick him out of a lineup. He's just a normal looking bloke. This is the face of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He was born in 1749. I've used a bit of software to swap his face onto mine, and for some reason this painting of him seems to work particularly well for this sort of thing. Seeing what looks like a photograph of him is very striking, especially in a modern setting taken with a modern camera. It makes him seem a lot more real, which is something I've talked about before. Obviously the software doesn't know exactly what Goethe looked like beyond what we're given in the painting. It doesn't know how the pores on his face were laid out, where each hair follicle on his face was, or anything like that. But it has a lot of data about people's faces from photographs, and it's able to recreate something convincing. Importantly, these tiny details aren't really important to us. If your best friend showed up and the arrangement of the pores on their skin had slightly changed, you probably wouldn't notice. The contrastive features of Goethe's face, the features that would allow us to recognise him if we saw him in the street, are captured within the painting. Konrad Heyer was born in the same year as Goethe, and there are actually photographs of him when he was an old man. For this reason alone, at least to me, Heyer strikes me as a more real person that you might have a conversation with, whereas Goethe seems like more of a reach. The realism barrier is a serious one. Another big gap between paintings and photography is that photographs are captured by an unconscious machine. Certain parameters are controlled by a human, like the exposure and the focus, but the machine is designed to record real photographic data. What we're seeing hasn't been filtered through a human brain, at least not nearly to the same degree as a painting has. Somebody with a lot of skill could have just made this face up or changed important details to make him look younger and more attractive. As it happens, we have several paintings of Goethe that agree on important aspects of his appearance, so this is probably close to what he actually looked like. Let's look at the important example of Vincent van Gogh. Sorry. I'm going to do a recording of myself pronouncing it right once, and then I'm going to just play that every time I say his name. Vincent van Gogh. Of all the people alive in 1889, he had an unusual number of paintings done of him, and he did most of them himself. But although photography had existed for a long time in 1889, it was still possible to go your whole life without being photographed. There are photos of Vincent van Gogh, but there are no confirmed, unambiguous photos of him later in life when he did most of his self-portraits. The dimensions of his face also varied dramatically from portrait to portrait. He wasn't aiming for photorealism, and so I would say if I saw him on the street, I probably wouldn't confidently recognise him. This gives latitude for a lot of different actors to play him, including Willem Dafoe in one of my favourite films ever, who's about 25 years too old, but he still plays it off very well. And this gives the strange effect of making Van Gogh seem more distant than he actually is. William Hartnell, who played the first Doctor Who, was born only 19 years after Van Gogh died. That's the difference between now and 2003. In fact, if Van Gogh hadn't died so young, he'd only been 54 when Hartnell was born. He could easily have lived to see the Second World War. The oldest recorded person to have ever lived died the same month as Princess Diana, but met Van Gogh when she was 13. One photo may or may not have been of Van Gogh. As far as I can tell, the only evidence is that it was taken at about the right time, in about the right place, and it looks like his self-portraits, but of course it could just be some bloke. I don't think there's any real evidence beyond the kind of vague circumstantial evidence saying that it might be him. People other than Van Gogh did portraits of him while he was alive, and these are nice things to use as reference when trying to work out what he might have looked like. This is my little reconstruction I made using a combination of a couple of apps and making some edits in Photoshop based on measurements of his portraits. Others have done similar things in the past. Our intuitions about what faces look like are often wrong, and this means that unless we're very skilled artists, we're likely to draw them pretty unrealistically. When my grandmother was giving me advice on how to draw faces, she said to ignore what you think the face looks like, and just treat it as a sequence of geometric shapes. Don't think about the fact that it's a person, just treat it as an object. If you don't do that, you start to reduce the face to general ideas you have about it, like I've noticed this person has high cheekbones, or I've noticed this person's eyes are quite far apart, or I consider this person to be fairly thin, so why is their face so wide when I draw it? And In reality, most people's faces are a lot more geometrically similar to each other than we realise. So when we're painting, we might exaggerate certain features just because we have to be tuned into the subtle differences in people's appearance in order to be able to recognise people. So any idea we have about their appearance relative to other people is going to be exaggerated. You know, a difference of a couple of millimetres can make a huge difference to how somebody looks. And on the page, if you think that somebody's eyes are further apart than average, you're not going to do a couple of millimetres, you're going to do a centimetre or two, which is usually way off, you know, far too much of a difference. The same thing's true of bodies as well if you've ever tried life drawing, which can be quite interesting. If we think of someone as tall and thin, we're likely to draw them a lot proportionally taller and thinner. This is all part of what I call the human filter. When we try and replicate a face, it's filtered through our ideas about what that person's face looks like. Because we're fine-tuned to the detail of human faces, we don't realise how tiny the differences actually are. That's the big leap between paintings and photographs. A camera doesn't have any ideas about what people should look like. It doesn't have any ideas about anything at all. All it does is pick up light that hits the sensor, and so it spits out an image which is so realistic that it would take a human years of unlearning our own preconceptions to generate something similar. But artists pre-photography did produce faces that look realistic, and modern artists produce very good likenesses, so there's a good chance people back then could as well. I suppose one way to test this is by comparing paintings and photographs of the same person from a time when photography existed but was too expensive for most people to bother with. Photos and portraits of Queen Victoria look pretty similar to each other, but early portraits from just pre-photography have eyes that look a little bit on the big side. This might have been a beauty standard thing, a tendency to make women look a bit more doe-eyed and porcelain-coloured than most real people actually are. And this makes it difficult to gauge the actual appearance of these people because eye shape and size has a really big impact on how a person looks. So if it's distorted in a non-linear way by the artist trying to make a person look prettier, it can make the person's actual appearance basically unrecoverable. This isn't the fault of the artists. Again, the purpose of a painting wasn't necessarily to accurately capture a person's appearance. Sometimes it is, but it could also have been something for somebody to look back on and say, look how pretty I was when I was younger. It could have been, look, I can afford to commission a painting. It could have been any number of things. How far back do people produce realistic paintings of faces? Of course, this isn't linear. Emphasis on realism hasn't just straightforwardly increased over time. Early medieval English depictions of people aren't realistic at all, whereas Roman sculptures from hundreds of years earlier seem to be very realistic, even to the point that people have reverse-engineered photorealistic images from them. Although a sculpture by makes clear, these sculptures aren't necessarily accurate depictions of historical figures. There's evidence that
Gaius Julius Caesar
had a skull deformity that was probably externally visible while he was alive, and it doesn't show up in some of the sculptures of him. If we could see these people's faces unfiltered through historical lenses, they'd probably seem a lot more like actual people. We might also think about them as if they were actual people. We might give them more credit for being intelligent and functioning members of their own societies, rather than just thinking of them as misguided and pre-scientific. Jan van Eyck, hopefully that's not too bad, was a painter operating in the early 1400s, and that's about as early as you're likely to get in the modern tradition of realistic painting. In a lot of his paintings, the lighting and colour are very dynamic and realistic, and he plays around with perspective in interesting ways. So in this one, I think the dynamic lighting makes it look really photographic in some places, but not in others. The most interesting thing is this mirror in the background, which shows the room from an angle we normally wouldn't see in a painting like this. Van Eyck's other paintings also capture faces very naturalistically. I can't find anything from earlier in the medieval period that does the same thing. Even if older techniques for recording faces can capture them with some accuracy, they're still removed from what a face normally looks like when we see it in various different ways. Strangely, a good painting is in many ways better than a lot of early photography. There's no way of getting accurate colour from a black and white photo. You can add colour retroactively, which many people do very skillfully, but you're making the decisions about what's done. If you have a lot of information about the scene, you might be able to get it very accurate, but that data is generated by you and not extracted from the photograph itself, which isn't a bad thing. It's a very, there are many people, as I say, who do it very skillfully, and it's a really difficult art to get right. The reason you can't extract colour from a black and white photo is because black and white photos are what we call monochrome. They only have one colour channel. The light-sensitive film records how much light hits any given particular bit of film. And if it's a lot of light, the film gets darker. If it's not much light, the film stays lighter. This image gets inverted, and then you have your photograph. This has only recorded the brightness, one dimension of colour. In digital photography, the brightness gets assigned a number from 0, black, to 255, white. A digital photo is made up of tiny blocks of solid colour called pixels, and in a black and white image, each of these pixels just has a brightness value somewhere between 0 and 255 assigned to it. For a colour photo, there are 3 of these colour channels, one which we call red, one which we call green, and one which we call blue. Combinations of different brightnesses along these 3 channels can make up more or less any colour we can see, and that's because human vision works in a similar way. We have 3 types of cone cell that pick up long, medium and short wavelengths of light, and a combination of these produces colour. You can't extract 3 colour channels worth of information out of just one colour channel. It's just 3 times the data. You can't just make that up out of nowhere. Early practitioners of colour photography found ways around this. If you took 3 black and white photos of the exact same thing, one through a red filter, one through a green filter, and one through a blue filter, then between those 3 photos, you'd have all the information you needed to make a colour picture. Each photo gives you a complete picture in one colour channel. If you look at these 3 photos, you'll see slight differences. With the red filter, Scott's eyes look very dark because there's no light reflecting off of them. With the green filter, there's a bit more of a contrast between the pupil and the iris. Some really beautiful pictures by Sergei I'm not going to attempt that one, show this technique in use in very early 1900s. You'll notice another problem with early photography in the filtered pictures. In the red filtered one, Scott's skin is really smooth, but in the blue filtered one it's a lot rougher. And that's because skin naturally scatters red light in the process of reflecting it. So in the red channel, the blemishes in your skin are effectively blurred out. The skin doesn't do this with blue light, so in the blue channel the actual roughness of your skin is visible. Because the images we see are a composite of 3 colour channels, skin always looks a bit smoother than it actually is because of the red component. The oldest styles of photography used chemicals that weren't sensitive to red light, mainly blue and ultraviolet, so this blurring effect doesn't happen, and in photos from the mid-1800s, people's skin looks rougher than it would if you met them in person. Also, if someone's wearing red, it comes out looking black, because the camera technology just wasn't sensitive to red light at all. Sometimes artists reconstruct faces based on people's skulls by estimating the thickness of the soft tissue, and this kind of thing is an interesting way of looking at faces from historical periods in which people didn't produce very realistic depictions of faces, but it comes with certain issues. A forensic reconstruction that uses one of these techniques is certainly going to look more like the original person than somebody randomly looking at a skull and guessing what they looked like, but a lot of factors can influence the thickness of soft tissue and the fat distribution and things like that, so reconstructing the musculature of the face will be sort of probabilistic, and it will be based on averages for the sex and age of the person. The skull also won't tell the artist anything about the hair colour and texture of the person, and they might have distinguishing features like a tattoo or a piercing or a soft tissue deformity that the artist doesn't know about, but that would have been obvious to anyone who saw them in real life. The same thing's true of prehistoric animal reconstructions. If a paleo artist was doing a reconstruction of an African lion from a skeleton, they'd have no idea about the mane, which is a really integral part of how a lot of people view lions. For extinct species like Neanderthals, we have no data on how the soft tissue was distributed, so even more artistic license has to be taken. I'm not saying I have a problem with this. I think it's a really nice way of incorporating forensic techniques into art, and it certainly is better than nothing. How do we recognise faces anyway? It's an impressive thing to be able to do, especially when you consider that we have to recognise faces from lots of different angles, which is a really geometrically complicated thing to do. So does that mean our brain is just full of 3D models of people's faces? A 2005 study showed that specific cells in the brain are responsive to specific people's faces. One participant was shown a load of pictures of different people and things, and a particular neuron in the brain only responded to 3 completely different pictures of Bill Clinton. 3 different pictures, so it wasn't just responding to something about the arrangement of the picture or the composition of the picture, but it was specifically responding to the fact that Bill Clinton's face was in it. There was a 2019 study that investigated what features of faces our brains use to recognise them. And this isn't too hard to study if you have enough participants. Just get a load of faces, edit certain features about them and show them to a load of people systematically to work out which features make people unable to recognise them anymore. It seems like people rely heavily on the shape of the eyes and eyebrows to recognise people, and also the hair, which is maybe an obvious one because it really does differ a lot between individuals. These are just my own thoughts, not based on research, but it seems to me like our catalogued models of what a person's face look like change over time as their face changes. And that might seem obvious, because for most of human history there was no point in remembering what a 60-year-old looked like in their 20s, because you were never going to see a photograph of them from back then. But I do wonder if we keep some recollection of what people used to look like. When I look at old pictures of my friends, even if I remember them being taken, I'm surprised at how they look. If I recall that memory without looking at a photograph, presumably my brain just uses its current model of their faces when reconstructing that memory. The memory doesn't, it's not like an HD recording, an HD video recording. It feels almost like my brain's just remembered the important details and it just reconstructs the imagery from scratch whenever it needs to replay it. When I recently looked at a recording of my mum from about 2003, which is a time I have memories from, I was shocked at how she looked. She had a haircut that I just completely don't remember her having, and of course she's in her mid-30s, which is the age some of my friends are now, so that's kind of weird. I'd been projecting her age backwards in time onto all my old memories of her. Hopefully these musings have got you thinking, and I'm sure you've thought a lot of these things yourself, and I'm sure you've thought other things that I haven't mentioned here. Thank you for watching, and I'll leave you with a few older depictions of faces that I find interesting.